not be good. Now, I called this the University on the Cloud, and considering whose vision, and I hope that by the end of today we'll have a sense of whose vision we're really after here, whether it's teachers or students or politicians or university administrators. I think we've got to know where we're going and why. Now, Neil, you set us some tough challenges for this meeting. Keeping teachers up to date was one of them, so I thought I'd look at that one. For academics, it's very difficult to keep up to date with new technology in teaching because they're doing that with their research, and that's where the focus is for academics in higher education. It has to be necessarily. That's where the money is. But increasingly, they are looking at how they can use technology in their teaching as well, and that's where they're going to need some help. So something to address that. And then for the institutional business planners, understanding how these kinds of disruptive technologies make a difference to how academic workload operates and where those costs and benefits come is really complex. So I want to talk about that too. So to begin with teacher professional development and supporting them in learning something about how to use these emerging technologies. Well, as Neil said, we are currently, we have been running a MOOC through Coursera, and we're going to rerun that again this year. So I wanted to talk a bit about that as an exemplar, because what we're talking about here today takes us all the way from the minutiae of what does it take to help people learn something, right to the kinds of global challenges that we've got. Covering all that in 20 minutes is a challenge. But here's diving deep into how do we help teachers actually think about what they can do with new technology. So the idea of this MOOC was to reach as many teachers as we could. And we got to some 9,000 or so registered. Of course, you get the big drop-off, but covering 174 different countries. When you've got a major global problem, like how do we get enough teachers, whichever sector we're talking about, whether it's the 100 million demand for higher education or the hundreds of millions demand for primary education, we've got a big problem of how we help teachers manage this. So MOOCs look like a good way of reaching really a lot of people and supporting them in this innovation process. But we didn't want to make it just another way of doing lectures. The point was to create the kind of pedagogy for this sort of professional development, where instead of just talking at them, you give them some updates, you give them some exemplars, you show them what other teachers are doing, but most importantly, as with any professional development course, you get them talking among themselves. And of course, MOOC pedagogy is perfect for that, because it does provide lectures and presentation, but it also provides forums. So this was the kind of style. It wasn't just, here's a lot of lectures for you to look at and here's a forum to join. It was, look at this lecture, which would last for maybe 5 minutes or something. Look at this example of teachers using this particular kind of technology, and now join this forum to talk about how you would use that technology in your own teaching, or the barriers that you would face, or the things you've already tried that didn't work. So they were very focused forums where all of these professionals could discuss their experience. So that was a kind of sequence of particular activities which they had to do, which orchestrated their work together. And at the same time, we wanted them to end up with something. So it's all very well going through this wonderful material on your course, but then what? How do you take that into practice? And building each week something to put into a course journal, which would be an action plan, or it would be something to make sure goes into the school strategy, or this would be a good idea for convincing the head that we need to do this, and so on. So it was carefully orchestrated, this pedagogy, to try and support them. And most of all, to bring them together in sharing ideas. Now, the Padlet wall is the most wonderful technology. It's not built within the MOOC platform itself, but there's no reason why you shouldn't take people out to a place where they can just double-click on a pinboard and say, here's the URL I use. So here we were trying to get people to think about how do you do computational thinking at primary level. Well, all of these teachers are very experienced professionals, but this is a very new idea. So getting them to share what they found, what they're interested in, what they think might work in this very visual way, and then go back to the forum to talk about each other's ideas was a very effective way of getting them to learn together. Now, how do they then get to share? Well, it's very difficult for teachers to share pedagogy, and one of the tools that we've been working on within the London Knowledge Lab. It's something called the Learning Designer, which is a way, an online tool of enabling you to express your pedagogy. But not just express it, but share it. So one of the things we set up is a learning design challenge, for example. We get lots of submissions of people's pedagogy, some of them in different languages. The first one here, I think, is in Spanish or Italian or something, so some we don't even understand, except with the help of Google Translate, which is fantastic, I must say. Then they have to tag it with what kind of pedagogy this is. Is it inquiry-based learning or collaborative learning and so on? Or they can search for other things, designs they're interested in through those sorts of categories. And of course, they can also search by topic. Now, the expression of the pedagogy looks like this. So you have, you're segmenting. This is a design for teaching people about the equations of motion. So what they're trying to get students to do is to represent the motion of a dog running through the woods. And they speed up and they slow down and they stop and so on. How do you use equations of motion and graphs and tables of numbers? So it's getting students to work with an online tool to see the relationship between all these different forms of representation. So the first bit of teaching is a predict, observe, explain exercise. And the teacher defines the first activity as a reading activity for 5 minutes, and the second one is the discussion activity. And these are represented by these different colors. Now, you add the next panel of activity, which is where they're having to look closer and do some calculations and do some analysis of what they're actually looking at. And as you see, as we go forward, the pie chart builds up to show you what overall collection of activities you're giving to the students. Does that look like a reasonable overall view of learning through discussion, through practice, through collaboration, through production, and so on? Just those 6 activities. It's also tracking how much time you're developing, because as you build in more, what teachers very often discover is they set out to build a 60-minute session, and they end up with a 3-hour session, because they're just not thinking properly about how much time they've really got. So the tool gives you feedback in 2 ways. It gives you feedback in terms of the kind of pedagogy you're creating, and also how the timing of that sequence is actually going to work out in practice. But also, of course, it allows you to edit that. And if somebody takes it over, they find it and browse through the library and they find it, then they can take that tool and understand how to build some pedagogy around a particular simulation program. And if they don't like that particular tool, they can put another one in. Or they can put their own picture of a dog or whatever it is. So everything is editable. And that's really important for professionals. They don't want to take what everybody else has done and just use it. They want to make it their own. They want to be able to adapt it, to customize it, to localize it. And then we use that, of course, in the MOOC that we were running. I think you'll find it a bit hard to read this, but it's just one of the comments from a teacher said, "My head of department couldn't believe the level pupils are working at and the clear understanding of features of the graphs, equations of motion, etc." So this is teachers learning from other teachers about the value of technology. Now, is collaborative innovation actually possible for teachers? Will they actually share? Will they put their things up? And one of the things that we noticed was that in the forum where they were talking about themselves using this tool, these were the kinds of adjectives they were using about this opportunity to use the tool to think about their own teaching and then share it with others. So that was a reasonable affirmation that that kind of approach does work for teachers. We're using it now within University College to help academics understand how their courses could use what somebody else has done in an entirely different course. The historians had a good way of getting discussion going. Well, the medics can use that. The pedagogy does transfer. So it's a way of enabling teachers to see how they can work together just as they do in science. So this particular tool does have a lot of visitors. It's just there. It's freely available online. I'd be delighted for you to use it if you'd be interested. Interestingly, in the evaluation of the MOOC, doing a peer review of somebody else's work got the highest level of approval of all the different kinds of pedagogies that we were using. Receiving a peer review got rated somewhat less, because none of us like to get the criticisms, of course, but But it worked very well as a good pedagogy, and it is what MOOCs do so well. They can offer that kind of advantage. So it's like the peer review process for an academic journal. And their understanding did change. It was a significant shift in a greater understanding of what they could do. And the overall experience got a high approval rating, 99% approval of good, very good, or excellent. So it worked. It is that large-scale CPD for teachers in any sector is viable. Now, if we're then addressing those big challenges, the Millennium Goal, for example, of universal primary education, UNESCO has calculated needs at least 1.5 million new teachers. How are we going to train so many teachers? Well, just think about the figures of what it takes to do a MOOC. We had 8 people from 8 different countries conducting our MOOC. We were operating at the level of about 1,000 students to 1. That's pretty large scale. But then you don't have to keep on doing that large scale, because each of those 8,000 teachers, if they take just 25 local teachers and upskill them, and each of those 25 local teachers takes just 8 in a local village community, and by the time you get to that level, universal primary education will need that sort of other teacher ratio. And you're just coaching adults to help the children learn to read or something like that. And then those adults maybe become teachers themselves through the same sort of process. So you begin to see how large-scale MOOCs and CPD and that kind of thing can begin to tackle those really big number challenges that we have globally in education, whether it's higher education, primary education, or anything in between. We do have the technology for MOOCs right now. We don't have the technology at that local level down in the villages, but it will come. It is coming. We'll get there eventually. So we've got to be starting to think this way about how we can meet those kinds of challenges. And I think we're going to be doing something, we hope, with UFI very soon, to do the same sort of thing for further education teachers in this country. Now, coming to the institutional level, what are we going to do about that? Because institutions have now got to understand what these disruptive technologies mean for our traditional practices within higher education, going from the face-to-face and the classroom, and the 1 to 12, 1 to 20, 1 to 25 staff-student ratio, it's something around that. What does that mean when you start going large scale? Well, we've been developing another kind of tool to help with that sort of process. It's called the Course Resource Appraisal Model, which usefully has an acronym CRAM, because it is exactly what we're doing. We're trying to cram an awful lot of teaching into a very small capacity for teachers. What the tool does is to give you this same kind of feedback as you're planning the teaching and learning activities and how long you're going to get students working for it over, say, a term or length of a module or something. It will show you what kind of learning experience you're generating. So it's giving you feedback on the nature of the student's learning experience you're describing, and given the different kinds of activities you're running, the kind of feedback they get. So for this one, this is modeling our MOOC, for example. They got a lot of peer feedback, which is the tall red line, because there was a lot of working on peer assessment and peer review and peer discussion forums and things like that. And the green line is the teacher feedback, because there were a number of teacher-supported discussions. And there was no computer-based feedback, not for us, because for our work, multiple choice questions aren't wonderful. So we didn't have too many of those. But in trying to model what this particular course looks like, that's the kind of representation we got. Now, excuse me. What we can also do, because we know for each of those different teaching activities how long it takes to prepare them, and then how long it takes to support them while the course is running, depending on the kind of student numbers you have, you can say, all right, so in the first run, we knew, because we tracked the time that teachers spent, it took us around 150 hours to generate that first version of the course, and it took us 60 hours to support it by joining in the forums and checking things and giving feedback week on week. over the course of the 6 weeks. Now, you can cost all that. You can say we know how much income we're getting from the students. We know how many students are paying a fee for the course. And in this case, I'm modeling this on the basis that they pay £10 per student. In fact, Coursera charges $49 for an accreditation certificate, an authenticated certificate. Most of them do it for free. Only a few opt to pay. So this is modeled on the number who pay, which is only 200. So there we had 9,000 people enrolling, 200 end up deciding to pay. So that's the business model. And what that shows is that in the first run, we get around a loss of around 6,000. So I was using the tool to say, well, how many do we need in order to break even if we run it 3 times? So I was assuming we double our student numbers each time, charge them £10 each, and what we ended up with was pretty much break even by the 3rd run. The only problem with that is that we didn't get £10 a student, we got £5 a student, because Coursera and University of London take their cut. So don't expect that MOOCs are going to bring in the money from the students unless you can get far more student numbers actually paying for it, or you charge them more, or you reduce your costs or something. That's what the tool tells you. So that's what we're after trying to help academics with, and indeed finance managers. Because unless we all understand what this is about, we're going to keep losing money. So what you do to get those numbers is you put in the basic data, and here we've got in for the first run, the second run, the third run, 200, 400, 800 paying students, paying £10 each. And then the other information you put in at the bottom is the definition of each of the different teaching and learning activities we're using, from video lectures to peer discussion to assignments and so on. So that's what gives a representation of what's actually in the course. You define each of the learning activities by saying it's got this kind of learning and the teacher's present or the teacher's not present. We've got group sizes of this amount and so on. And it shows you what kind of learning experience you've got using the same kind of pie chart. And then we want to know how much time this all takes. So for each learning activity again, you say how many student learning hours are there per week, how many hours does it take the teacher to prepare the first run, and that's a lot because it's the first time you're doing it. The second run, you're just fixing the mistakes, and the third run is kind of stable state. So it's getting all of that data from experienced teachers, deciding whether it's high-cost or low-cost staff, and that's enough of a split to get a rough approximation to the reality of very different costs of staff. And also, how many hours does it take you to support each week as you go through? That's all you need, and it's just basic arithmetic to end up being able to say, so we know how much time we put in, we know the benefits that the students get, we know we can break even on this basis, but we don't have that basis. How do we go back and change it all? So unless we've got that kind of ownership of what it takes to make sure that we've got a viable proposition when we go online, and it's no good saying, well, just because we've got large numbers, we've therefore got the money rolling in. It doesn't work like that. You've got a lot of staff time to support those large numbers, or the large numbers don't actually appear. And then what do you do? So we have to recognize that online learning will change the learning benefits, and we should be making sure we achieve those benefits. It's no good if that pie chart just ends up a blue, entirely blue, because all the stuff is learning through acquisition, just watching and reading and listening. So we've got to take advantage of the technologies to make that pedagogy really work. And it's going to change, therefore, the distribution of teaching activities, which are always done on an annual basis, not recognizing that you've got a lot of upfront costs and that can amortize over later years or later runs. So the pattern of the teaching workload changes, and we have to recognize that teaching now is innovation. So that's got to be understood not just by the academic staff, but also by heads of department, finance officers, and everybody else. This is a game changer. Online is a game changer. Large scale is a game changer. And we can't just use those same old ways of accounting and finance models that we have done previously in academic life. So the idea is treat academics as if they know what they're doing with teaching and learning. Don't assume that just because they're teaching the same old way, they're Luddites and hate technology. They love technology. They use technology all the time. They're innovating with technology in their research. But doing that in the context of teaching is really difficult because we don't have the right models, we don't have the support. So that's what we've got to change at institutional level. And strategies at institutional level are therefore going to be very important. So the vision then for professionalizing teaching, because that's really, I think, what we're doing. We're saying it's important for every academic not just to be a professional researcher, but also be to a professional teacher in the sense that you keep updating your knowledge and skills and learning from others. Then the solution has to be using collaborative learning, and via MOOCs makes it large scale. And to do collaborative learning, it's not enough just to be in a discussion forum. You've really got to be sharing that knowledge just as we do in the context of scholarly journals. We don't just rely on chatting to each other. We rely on seeing what someone else has done and what effect they achieve with it and what we can do to build on that. So that's not a bad model for how we should be doing the same thing in innovating in teaching and learning. And finally, the institutional business planning. Give academics the tools for understanding this, because we've got to be aware of how our time is being used. Now, when we developed this CRAM tool, the bottom line there said profit/loss to tell you whether you were making money or not. And everybody hated that. We had to change it. We had to make it difference, which was nice and neutral. Because academics hate money. They don't think about money. It's all left to the finance department. And we can't go on like that. We've got to put into academics' hands the tools for understanding how their workload is being used and how we use the technologies to benefit the students. So that, I hope, begins to answer some of the great challenges that you set us, Neil. So thank you very much.
Okay, some